We have a session with Bill Quigley and Kathy Kelly this evening on the Merchant of Death War Crimes Tribunal. And if you don't know about it, you're going to know about it at the end of our session here. This session may go a little longer than an hour. We always say, well, our webinars are about an hour long. This one we're going to let roll on a little bit because there's a lot to say about it, and I'm sure there'll be some questions and answers. So if you need to jump off after an hour, of course, that's what you've got to do. But we'll probably go at least an hour and 15 minutes, just as a heads up. So if you are not familiar with the sponsor of this webinar, the War Industry Resisters Network, welcome to us. We do webinars just about every month. And I'm going to ask our colleague and friend, Paul Shannon, to tell you about us. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you, Ken. So what we're hoping is that more and more of you, if you belong to an organization or a local group, will join our network, because the War Industry Resisters Network is a network of groups opposing military contractors in their communities or on their campus. We oppose the weapons they create, whether nuclear weapons or conventional, all these different weapons of mass destruction that they produce in our communities. We oppose their insistence on devouring our national treasure. They will receive about half of the $858 billion that Congress just passed in our military budget. And we oppose them mainly because of their control over our most important government policies about war and peace. They were significant players in the decision to expand NATO starting in the late 90s through all their lobbying and think tanks and all their personnel that floods our government. They were instrumental in pushing for the modernization of our nuclear weapons program. These are very dangerous entities. These are companies that present a clear and imminent danger to our country and our world. So we are dealing with institutions that are right at the core of the problems that many of us have been organizing around for many, many years. And so the War Industry Resisters Network is going to take them on. And we ask you to get involved with us. I'm just putting now the various links to both the presentation tonight on the Merchants of Death project, as well as our website, our Facebook page. Please send us an email if you belong to a group that would like to be part of our network. We engaged, as you can see, in webinars, in direct action, in coordinated campaigns. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, a sister organization, a sister project that we hope to link up with. And I think we should get right into it and hear what they have to say.
Great. Thanks, Paul. And I'm going to read you the bios for Kathy and Bill, and then we'll get right into it. So Bill is going to go first, and many of you know our two presenters, but some information you might not know. Bill is an emeritus professor of law at Loyola University in New Orleans, where he was on the faculty for over 30 years. Bill's been an active public interest and human rights lawyer since 1977. He's served as counsel with a wide range of public interest organizations on issues including Katrina, social justice issues, public housing, voting rights, death penalty, living wage, human rights, civil liberties, educational reform, constitutional rights, and civil disobedience. Bill has litigated numerous cases with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the Advancement Project, and with ACLU of Louisiana, where he was general counsel for over 15 years. He's been an active lawyer with the School of the Americas Watch and the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. Bill served as legal director of the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York City from 2009 to 2011. And Kathy Is a peace activist, as most of us know, and an author. Made over 24 trips to Afghanistan from 2010 to 2019, living with young Afghan peace volunteers in a working class neighborhood in Kabul. She learned about conditions in Afghanistan through encounters with mothers and children, many of whom were directly affected by the war. With Voices in the Wilderness Companions from 1996 to 2003, she traveled 27 times to Iraq, defying economic sanctions and remaining in Iraq throughout the shock and awe bombing and the initial weeks of the invasion. Voices delegations also went to Lebanon during the 2006 summer war between Israel and Hezbollah, and to Gaza in 2009 during Operation Cast Lead. Kathy's been an educator for most of her life, but she believes children of war and those who are victims of violence have been her most important teachers. She's the board president of World Beyond War and co-coordinator of the Ban Killer Drones campaign. So thank you so much, Bill and Kathy, for being here. And Bill, it's all yours.
Terrific. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for the opportunity. And I feel like I know half the 200 something people on who have been identified of this. And I realize that you all are teachers and leaders and organizers and the like. And so, sometimes people say you're preaching to the choir. And I'm fortunate enough that my oldest son is a classical choral director. And he said, Dad, don't worry about that. He said, every choir needs practice. And so even though a lot of the things that we're going to talk about tonight may not be new, it's good to brush up on them. And also that you, as leaders of our peace and justice community around the United States and around the globe, can help us spread the word about what a group of us are trying to do. And so now I'm going to try and start. This is a basic introduction to war crimes, war crime tribunals, what this one's about and the like. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then Kathy Kelly is going to do what she does so well, is to tell the stories of a few individual examples of the war crimes that we're talking about. So with that, I'm going to try to share the screen, which is always okay. Ken, I can see you. You're nodding your head, so I guess it works. Great. Okay. This is just a general introduction about what this is up to. And this is building on the work that a lot of you have done. So we're not saying that we're starting anything new. We do have a website, and I would encourage people to go take a look at that website. And the goal is to give the basic who, what, where, why, and how of what the plan is. So starting off, the Merchants of Death, we chose that name particularly because these folks, these corporations, they are profiting off of death. They're profiting off of death in our names, the names of our countries, but also they sell to many other countries that do the same thing. So it's a war crimes tribunal, and we're going to explain what war crimes are and what a tribunal is. That November, we're planning this for November of 2023, and this is just a basic introduction to the goals of what we're doing here. Okay, now it doesn't move for me. We practiced this a few minutes ago and it all worked fine, but it doesn't work. Let's see here. I see something down below. Let me try that. Okay, obviously, you know what we're about and you're about and what this whole thing is about justice. So let's start with just make sure we're all on the same page in terms of how big a bite out of our national gross product and the like, our defense spending is. And we talk about the arms race. And as you can see from this, there is really no race. It's like we have done more than the next any number of countries put together. And I told the organizers of this that this PowerPoint is going to be available to anybody who wants it at the end. So you don't have to make any notes for this if you want, but this is the latest from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is a terrific source for basic information about what we're talking about here that all of us can use. 800 billion. And you can see from this little chart here, so we're not just talking about sales to ourselves. This is not just that we're spending on our own country, but there is a tremendous market for weapons and death that companies in the United States are servicing around the world. Again, these are not numbers that anybody's contesting. These are widely available congressional numbers and the like. So that's it. And in terms of who we're talking about, the merchants of death, the investigation that we're in the investigation phase now, is aimed at the top 4 arms producing corporations in the United States. And you can see they're talking about Lockheed Martin, talking about Raytheon, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman. Now, they're not just the 4 biggest in the United States. They are the 4 biggest in the world. And they offer a full buffet of ways to kill people, from very small individual ways to groups to cluster bombs to things that can destroy entire communities. So that's really the focus that we're talking about. And we're talking about, for these 4 companies, corporations, public corporations, war crimes. Not just that they're bad, not just they're wasting money, not just that, for each one of these missiles, you could build an elementary school, et cetera, which we will talk about in due course. But we're talking specifically about that they are engaged in war crimes. So start with the question, what is a war crime? Some of us know this, some of us need to be brushed up on that. There is a specific definition of what a war crime is. It's put out by the United Nations, the office that you can see on this slide. And there is a statute, it's called the Rome Statute, United Nations Rome Statute. It says specifically what war crimes are, and it's much longer than this page that I'm showing you. But these are sort of the highlights, some of the worst things that are involved. Everything from murder, clearly attacking civilians, humanitarian assistance. We have episode after episode of targeting of hospitals, for example, targeting of schools, targeting of community centers, attacking undefended buildings, dwellings, or town, and inflicting long-term severe damage to the natural environment. And we can talk about all of these at substantial length, but this is the beginning, war crimes. Now, usually when we think of war crimes, we think about them in terms of countries committing war crimes, right? And so but what we're talking about here is another section of the war crimes statute, this international law about war crimes, that includes calling people war criminals who aid, abet, or otherwise assist in the war crimes themselves, including specifically, the words are, providing the means for its commission. So the means for its commission, could these war crimes occur without Lockheed Martin? Could they occur without Raytheon? They could not occur, because the technology of many of these weapons is that not only do the companies provide the weapons, they provide the training for the weapons, they provide the servicing for the weapons, they provide the supplies for the weapons, the resupply, the retraining, the upgrading, and the like. So it's not as if these corporations just have a bunch of weapons in a warehouse and somebody from some country comes and says, I'll take one from aisle 4 and one from aisle 5. No, these are lobbied for, tried, recruited, they are marketed, and then they provide the entire packet of services for people. So the question really for our tribunal, and I think for all of us who are concerned about this, is have these 4 corporations aided and abetted and provided the means for war crimes? So we're talking about General Atomics, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon, right? Okay. So then the question is, well, that's fine, Bill, but what is a war crimes tribunal? A little bit of history for those of us who took history more than a few years ago, trying to keep up on that. War crime tribunals are courts of law. established to try those accused of committing atrocities and crimes against humanity during wartime. And I think that we are familiar with, the first one, the first major one that we're talking about is the Nuremberg trials of 1945, 1946, where the United States, Great Britain, and others held up the actions of the head of the German military actions, held them up to the international standards, and held trials to see if folks were actually guilty of war crimes. That was a 2-year process. The same sort of process went on Tokyo and other years. The other official ones that have happened for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, these are international tribunals of criminal trials for people accused of war crimes. And it is important to understand that there is precedent for holding private corporations and private individuals accountable as well, not just a general, not just a leading official. Or, for example, the 3 examples that I'm just going to point to very briefly, and we'll do a lot more of this in November when we get to this, is that I think some of us are familiar with the Zyklon B issue of during the Second World War, that this private company was providing poison gas to be used in the Holocaust. And they were found guilty of war crimes because of the actions that they took. They said, well, we're just providing a service. We don't know what happens, et cetera. Well, you knew, or as you will see later, should have known. Same sort of thing in the second example, poison gas, the sellers of poison gas to Saddam Hussein, who used that against Iran. And then thirdly, the private sale of weapons and supplies to people who use them in mass genocides in Sierra Leone. So there's specific rules of what people can do and can't do, how they're supposed to do it, and the like. We are obviously not a court of law, right? We are peace and justice people from in the United States and from around the world, who are going to be doing a people's war crime tribunal. We did not invent this. This is not something that is brand new, even though we may take a little bit of time to remember what happened. But people's tribunals don't have the effect of law, but they do have the effect of holding people publicly accountable, holding corporations, holding countries and the like, and shine light on situations and gather evidence that could be used later by the International Criminal Court. First, one of those, the one that people go back to, is Bertrand Russell chaired a tribunal on the Vietnam War in 66 and 67 with people from across the world, where they heard testimony, they looked at documents, and they ultimately unanimously found that the United States was guilty of genocide, use of forbidden weapons, mistreatment, killing of prisoners, violence, and the like in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. You'll notice as you compare what happened officially and unofficially is that the people who win the wars are never prosecuted, right? Not officially anyway, because they won. So the people who are prosecuted are the people who have lost the wars. And that's where it's important for us to hold our own selves and our own corporations accountable. There have been other tribunals that have investigated war crimes in Latin America, Chile, Iraq, Palestine, Kashmir, and recently, most recently, is the murder of journalists around the country, around the world. So this tribunal, through the testimony of witnesses and factual development, are going to hold accountable U.S. weapons manufacturers who knowingly produce and sell products which attack and kill not only combatants, but non-combatants as well. Though there's nobody on this call who's not aware of the fact that civilians are often killed, civilian gatherings are often bombed, that civilian infrastructure is targeted, and that is done intentionally, or it is the cost of war. And the expectation is that these weapons manufacturers will say, well, we're just selling something. We're not, we're not actually pointing them. We are not actually dropping the bomb. We are not doing this, that, and the other. But it's to whether they knew or should have known that the things that they are selling and delivering and servicing and supplying are used to commit human rights crimes. The scope of the War Crimes Tribunal, the Merchants of War, again, focused on those 4 companies, is broad. And this is where we are at this moment in terms of the investigation of what has happened in these countries. And we'll be attempting to gather enough evidence to meet the threshold requirements of the statutes for war crimes. And as just one example, I know that this group of people has, focused along with lots of others on the situation in Yemen. Look at it. I don't know if you can see the detail on this slide or not, but we're talking about 6,000 guided missile kits in Yemen alone from Boeing. Talking about 515 engines for fighter jets, 5,000 Hellfire missiles, 16,000 guided bombs, 400 and something tanks, and over $100 billion just in that one armed conflict alone. And the number of people in the right-hand corner, the number of known people that were killed that we know about, civilians, is in the hundreds. So we hope to be able to subject a number of these campaigns to the same sort of analysis. And as I close up, I just want to make it clear that we are not inventing this wheel, right? The peoples have held war crimes tribunals before. They haven't held any for the arms manufacturers. But there is precedent too, is that our sisters and brothers in France and the international community, Amnesty, and a bunch of other groups put together a 300-page complaint against weapons manufacturers in France. We're not talking about ours. We're talking about the weapons manufacturers in France, focusing primarily on the selling and servicing of equipment, war crimes material in Yemen, particularly. And they filed that with the International Criminal Court, and just recently they filed it in the country courts of France itself. Again, trying to hold them accountable. It has been done in Belgium, it's been done in the UK, it's been done in other places, and sometimes it actually, in and of itself, is able to do something to modify the stream of death that we are sending out from our country. But all of our journeys, all of us have been on many justice journeys, and we realize that steps that we're at are important along the way. The process of this has begun. Officially, each of these 4 corporations was served with subpoenas to produce information, produce people who would be willing to testify, to produce, and the information we're looking at is not only just the weapons that they produce, the profits that they've made, the number of military people who serve on their boards of directors, the people who are their consultants, their lobbyists, how much they're paying to members of Congress in terms of that. So to show how these companies, these corporations have integrated themselves into the political system. One of them brags in one of their things that they have a branch of their company in every single congressional district in the United States. So they have intentionally put people in every congressional district in the United States to be able to leverage the opportunities that are provided. As Paul pointed out earlier, $800 billion, which was tremendously more than the military services asked for, much more than the Biden administration asked for, and the like. And it's just, they have their own separate government and separately funded as we go forward. So what we're at the point that we're at now is facts are being gathered, witnesses are being interviewed, atrocities are being investigated, all with the idea of putting those together for a public trial in November of 2023. And the idea will be that there will be a series of jurists who will take that under consideration and within whatever amount of time it's necessary, be able to issue their own opinion about the liability or not of these corporations. The theme of our tribunal, I would like you to look at the bottom of this slide first. This is Justice Robert Jackson, who was the chief prosecutor of the Nuremberg war trial, for us prosecuting the Nazi leadership and the like. He later became a member of the US Supreme Court. And this is his quote in the 1940s. If acts and violations of treaties are crimes, they are crimes whether Germany does them or whether the United States does them. We are not prepared to lay down a rule of criminal conduct against others, which we would not be willing to have invoked against ourselves. That is our challenge, and that is the focus of what's going to happen. A couple of the people, we have a lot of co-sponsors, and we're certainly looking for more, but we thank all of them for doing that. And again, I remind you the date and the time and where you can find some more information, and my email if you want to talk to me about getting a copy of this. But our hosts tonight will have copies of this and are available to share them with anybody. So now I will stop sharing and turn it over to Kathy Kelly. And I was smart enough to realize I didn't want to follow Kathy Kelly. That's just, I followed her. We went to Gaza together. I followed her to Baghdad and some other places, and I'm happy to follow her, but I'm not going to follow her in a presentation. So take it away, Kathy.
Well, Bill, thank you so much. And I'm so grateful to all of the people who've joined us tonight, and certainly to MAPA and War Industry Resistance Network for hosting this gathering. So it seems that it's going to be very important for this tribunal to have people giving the testimony come from the places that the United States has attacked. And we're working very hard to accomplish that. And of course, if any of you would like to help with contacting people or with doing research, you would be so welcome. And we also want to do every month an action building up to the November 2023 tribunal. And the next action in February will in fact be in Washington, D.C. at the Raytheon headquarters, and then moving over to the Pentagon. And the theme is for Valentine's Day, melt your cold, cold hearts. And why do we find it so cold-hearted to approach the consequences of the defendants' usage, development, storage, and sale of these weapons? One of the stories that has been on my mind a great deal ever since October of 2015, October 3rd in 2015, is the story of the bombing of the Kunduz hospital. And this was a bombing which occurred from 2:08 a.m. to 2:37 a.m. in the morning. And the owners of the hospital, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, once they knew that the hospital was being bombed, had notified the United States military, the United Nations. They were calling everybody they could. And the bombing continued until parts, the emergency room and the intensive care unit were completely destroyed. And the numbers of people killed were 42 people, 14 of whom were hospital staff. So it fell to Dr. Joanne Liu, who was the international head of Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, to go to Kunduz and, as she puts it, do rounds. But she was doing the rounds through trashed wreckage, and then to deliver condolences. So thank you, Brian, for helping us, Brian Garvey, for helping us see a video of Dr. Liu. This was put out by her own organization, and you'll hear her anguished tale and then see her delivering the condolences.
This area was not normally an area where the patients were, but we were full, when the beds were full, so everyone who was coming, even like discharged patients, were sort of put temporarily in this room.
Here in Kunduz, we had real intensive care unit. I remember patient being intubated, paralyzed, and we were really given the best we could have offered. And so now we did rounds again. I did rounds about hearing the story of each patient. Wow.
There was a blast when he was crossing, so they found parts of his body inside and part of his body outside. And this is where.
And I think hearing the stories of, or particularly about a patient that the younger was doing better, and then we've told the parents, come tomorrow because she's safer here. And then when they came back and claimed back the body the next day, they could only see ashes. There was nobody to pick up. So, yeah, a very profoundly disturbing experience.
In memory of Abdul Masoud, Abdul Nasir, Abdul Salam.
We had this, I would say, unique and very overwhelming emotional moment to bring our word of sympathy from across the movement to the families of our staff who lost their lives.
And you, the families left to mourn.
So after the ceremony, we had a moment with the family to discuss with them in a more personal way. So it was a very intense moment. They shared their, I would say, their sorrow, but as well their anger and their question.
In military parlance, when someone runs away from this kind of an attack, that person is referred to as a squirter. And the crew of the AC-130 gunship said that there were 50 squirters, which they thought was a pretty high number. And I happened to meet one of the people who had tried to run. His name was Khalid Ahmed, and he was a student pharmacist. And his mother had said, Khalid, don't go to the Kunduz hospital. It's too dangerous, because there was a lot of fighting going on in the area. And Khalid reminded his mother that they had treated 59 children the previous day, and how could he stay away? Who would take his place? So he went to his job and performed his shift, and then was to sleep overnight in the basement of the hospital and then go back to work. And all of a sudden, there was a huge explosion at about 2 o'clock in the morning. And he and the head pharmacist ran up to find security and try to figure out what was happening. And the security people said, well, it has to be the Americans or Afghans, because the Taliban don't have planes. And so the security people told Khalid Ahmed, look, take apart your cell phone, because that could draw attention. And all we can tell you, man, is just, run for the gate. And so the chief pharmacist ran first, and he made it. And then they said to Khalid, okay, run. And he started to run. And just as he got to the gate, he took shrapnel on his back. And he started to bleed profusely. He collapsed to the ground. He could see he was going to lose consciousness. But he managed to pull the cell phone with his one working arm out of his backpack, get it back together, call his father, because in Afghan tradition, if you know you are going to die and you can reach your father, you call your father to say you're sorry for anything you might have ever done to harm him or the family. And so the father got from Khalid Ahmed exactly where he was. He said, my son, put your vest underneath you and it can stop the bleeding. And they had relatives that lived nearby, and they raced to the first entrance to the hospital, and they were able to scoop up Khalid's broken body and get him the 5-hour tortuous drive to a hospital in Kabul, the emergency surgical center for victims of war, where they were able to heal him. And when Khalid Ahmed had told his story, he noticed that I was in the group. And so he asked my young friends, well, who is she? And they said, well, she's like our grandmother. And then he said, well, where is she from? And they said, America. And then he asked them to ask me, why would your people want to do this to us? We were only trying to help people. And I think that question is so important for us to be held accountable to. And then we, in turn, ought to hold accountable the two companies that helped to make this AC-130 gunship. The airframe is made by Lockheed Martin, and then the Boeing Corporation rigs it up with Bofors cannons and howitzer guns. And that's how this ship that sort of circled around the hospital was able to keep on firing at the hospital, even after they'd been begged to stop by the Médecins Sans Frontières head in Kabul. They kept on firing. And Khalid Ahmed deserves an answer to his question. It kind of greenlighted the idea of bombing hospitals. And Saudi Arabia, when they bombed another hospital run by Doctors Without Borders in Yemen, was challenged. You can't do that. You can't be bombing hospitals. And the Saudi officials said kind of cheekily, well, we'll ask our American advisors for advice about that. But when the United States can bomb a hospital, others then start to do that as well. The next sample testimony I'd like to pay attention to is in a country that wasn't on the list that Bill gave us, but we are thinking maybe we'll look into this as well. And this is Lebanon. And the year would be 2006. There was, in the summer of 2006, a war between Israel and Hezbollah. And Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, had said to the Israelis, don't sign a ceasefire yet. We can get you what's in slang terms called the bunker buster, their newest version of a bunker buster bomb, a guided bomb unit, and it can burrow under the ground and then explode. Well, in the town of Hana in southern Lebanon, there were two families, the Shalhoub family and the Hisham family, and they had jointly figured out that a building still under construction did have a pretty solid basement, and engineers had said, this can withstand anything that the Israeli Defense Forces have. So they would bring their children into the basement of this building and then collect the children in the morning and give them breakfast. And well, the bunker buster bomb attacked that civilian residence. And it's a bomb that's made by the Raytheon Corporation. And it happened that I was with a team of 3 companions with voices, and the bombing happened on July 30th, but people couldn't have funerals for their loved ones until the bodies could be exhumed. And so 26 people had been killed, 16 of whom were children. And when we walked into the town of Hana, we actually had from Norman Finkelstein a list of the massacres that he believed had happened in southern Lebanon over the course of this 34-day war. And we walked into the funeral for families and children. And so Farah Makhtarazadeh and I sat down on the front patio of the Shalhoub family home, and we listened as the mother began to ask us, didn't they know? Didn't they see? And she had on a medical hood and a neck brace, and she was kind of wincing as she pointed up above. And to be honest, I didn't understand what she meant at the time, but I believe now she was pointing up above to say, didn't the drones that were flying overhead see? that I picked up my daughter every morning when she came out from that building. Didn't they know? Didn't they see? And then she sent her son to get a stack of newspapers, and we could see a helmeted relief worker holding up the lifeless body of her daughter, Zainab, and groaning in agony at the abject sorrow of this. And then she asked her son to bring another photo, and this was the framed photo of her little daughter. Big saucer eyes, a very serious face, curly, tousled hair. And she tapped the plastic over that photo, and she asked us, is she the terrorist? Who is the terrorist? Activists in Derry, Northern Ireland, were so outraged by what had happened, particularly knowing that the Raytheon Corporation had a facility right there in Derry. And so they resolved that they would go and occupy that facility. And as I got it, they opened up the windows, they unplugged the computers, and they dropped them out the windows, crash, crash, crash. And they did quite a good bit of damage. And I thought, oh dear, these people are not going to get off. But they also went to visit with the Shaloub family, and they got the testimony of people like Mariam Shaloub. And when they brought that back into court, they were able to invoke the necessity defense, saying that they acted as they did to prevent a greater harm, and they were acquitted. The Derry Nine were acquitted on almost all charges. Emma McCann was charged with having stolen a computer disk, but it was actually a great triumph for the Irish peace movement, and shows, I think, how close people can get to being able to stop the warmongers. And that's something that we hope can be accomplished also through this Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. So the Raytheon paveway bunker busting bomb has been used in multiple places. And the third action I'd like to draw attention to happened in Yemen. And this is an action that's described in great, great detail by Jeffrey E. Stern in an article that he wrote for the New York Times Magazine. And each time I read it, I sense something that I hadn't quite realized before. Well, in Yemen, because of drought and because of war, there were many, many people that didn't have enough water to maintain their livestock. They couldn't irrigate their crops. And in a very remote area of Yemen, a small town called Ahab, people were in a panic. What are we going to do? And so they did the best they could. They linked together and they pooled their money, but they also relied on a very generous fellow, Rabian. And they hired a rig, and they hoped to dig for water. And unfortunately, for a couple of weeks, they thought, oh, we've all lost our shirts. The rig broke down and it had to be repaired, and there wasn't any water, and they kept on digging. And then finally, eureka, one afternoon, they hit water. And so the townspeople were wild to celebrate. One of the rig owner's friends called him in a panic and said, the Saudis are hitting sites where wells have been discovered. You ought to be careful. And the fellow said, we're way the hell out here in the middle of nowhere. Nobody's going to come and hit us. But he was wrong. As the celebration went on, at about 1 o'clock in the morning, a Saudi warplane outfitted with a bomb that was created by Raytheon and manufactured in Arizona flew over this celebration. And the pilot hit the button, and that released this bomb, which was about the size of a compact car. And then when the bomb dangles from the plane, kind of like a fuse or an umbilical cord, that gets cut. And then as soon as that happens, the bomb sort of comes to life. It sprouts fins, and there's a laser-guided system so that the bomb went hurtling through the air. And when the nose cone of the bomb hit the cement, the equivalent of 200 pounds of TNT exploded, and shards from the bomb started to fly in all different directions, 8 times the speed of sound. So if one of those shards hits a human being, the person could be decapitated or disemboweled or maimed. Their bodies would be rearranged. And so this was a horrible, frightening thing that had happened. And Jeffrey Stern interviewed many of the people who had suffered through that night. But the next morning, the townspeople thought, well, we have to go and find out what happened. And the children, of course, were way out ahead of everybody else. They went running, and they started to realize that they were finding body parts and fragments of clothing. And then what happened next is that the warplanes returned and started to bomb the civilians who were out trying to collect the bodies of victims and try to get anybody who survived to a hospital. And people said it went on for hours, and they felt like it must be that the warplanes were trying to exterminate them. They were diving into the cornfields. They were running as fast as they could. And ultimately, there were 31 civilians killed, 42 injured, and certainly no hospitals nearby. And a woman named Priyanka Motaparthi went to Yemen, and she was able to go through the craters. People hadn't really removed very much. They were afraid to touch any of the debris that was left. And she discovered a part which was a clear indication that the bomb had been manufactured by Raytheon. It had the number, and it had the data that was necessary to draw that conclusion. And the United States has been selling this kind of weaponry to Saudi Arabia throughout all of the years of this vicious war. Now, you probably have heard about the terrible problems with cholera that Yemenis also were afflicted by. And Jeffrey Stern, it's conjecture, but he says, you know, people became very reluctant to dig wells because maybe if the Saudis were going to attack their infrastructure and attack their wells, they might possibly be killed for doing so. Jeffrey ends that article by saying that Fahd, one of the survivors who had sat with him night after night telling him what happened, and who was always experiencing terrible headaches and pains because of the wounds that he'd sustained, he took Jeffrey's hand, and it was as though he wanted Jeffrey to feel for a fever, but instead he guided Jeffrey's hand so that Jeffrey felt the shards of the bomb that were embedded in Fahd's face. And he said it was really quite ironic that he had wanted to follow the journey of an American manufactured bomb to its destination, and he found it in the cheek and forehead of a man who had thought he had something to celebrate. So yes, we should hold these weapon manufacturers accountable. We should tell them that the kinds of crimes being committed are not acceptable, and that for way too long a time, they have exacerbated and prolonged wars and caused enormous suffering, and it doesn't defend anyone. If we were really going to defend ourselves against the great terrors we face, we would be working to defend ourselves from ecological collapse, from the effect of pandemics, from nuclear weapon proliferation, and that requires people to collaborate and come together internationally and stop these terrible, terrible arms productions. So thank you very much for listening to all of that. We now look forward very much to your questions, comments, suggestions. We have so much to learn from one another. Thank you.
Oh, just take a moment, everyone, to collect our wits here. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Bill. So hard. Well, the way we're going to do this is if you have a question, and please do have a question when you make your comment, have a question for Kathy or Bill. is go to the reaction button at the bottom or wherever it is on your screen. And in there is a raise hand function. You can see Cynthia has already raised her hand. So what we'll do is take you one at a time as your hands are raised and, see how much time we have to have questions and answers. Okay, Cynthia, you're first. Go ahead. You have to unmute yourself, right?
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted now. I'm trying to overcome the grief I feel right now to ask two brief questions. One is it legal for war companies like Lockheed Martin to meet with foreign leaders, as Lockheed has done with Zelensky and also the Saudis? That was one quick question. The other one is, who's gathering the data on civilians killed? How do we get that information? Thank you both so much.
Mhm. Bill, can you take that first part of Cynthia's question?
Yes, to my knowledge, Cynthia, I think it's totally legal what they're doing. That they are not just meeting, they are whining and dining and lobbying and paying for things, and they are soliciting business, they are recruiting, and so and clearly this is a huge part of the economy, and this is something that, though horrifying and shameful, to my knowledge, it is totally legal for them to do it, which is part of one of the, I'll just say one more thing, is that is often a defense of people who are involved in war crimes, is that, look, I was just following the law. Everything we did was legal in the United States. Everything we did was legal in Germany. Everything we did was legal in Yugoslavia. Everything we did was legal in Rwanda and the like. And there is a very important part of international law which says there is a law of human rights that supersedes your legal authority from whatever government gives you permission to do this. And if your government gives you permission to sell the kinds of bombs that Kathy is talking about, that doesn't mean that they are legal. It doesn't mean that you can't be held accountable for them. And that's what this tribunal is, a step along the way to try to hold them accountable for it.
So they can be like our State Department and meet with foreign leaders.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Cynthia, there was a very interesting radio presentation that I think originated in a Boston University radio station, and NPR played it. And a woman named Jill Gibbons is an artist, and she has made it her business for the last 2 decades to, as an undercover, go inside of the big, huge weapons fair. And she's gone through 3 passports and 3 different identities, but she gets in there, and they have all the trappings to normalize doing what they do. But she did overhear one person who said something to the effect of, "You've really got to be drunk in order to cut any of these deals." So that one of our hopes is to be able to get people to say, "Hey, how about you break ranks?" And perhaps there is less of a sense of being at ease with this abject form of making a living. I just want to mention that Nick Mattern, who is very much a part of the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal, is keeping track of any of the information people are offering to us in the chat. So thank you for doing that, and it will be put to good use. And then I'm just so pleased to see that Nicholson Baker is on this call. And if you ever get a chance to read his book, Human Smoke, and then his more recent book about bases, I think that helps to put us in the mindset of how much chicanery and lying and misleading information goes on prior to every war.
Thank you, Cynthia. Mary Teresa, you're next. Unmute yourself. Go ahead.
I'm just thinking, I'm trying to imagine war with combat troops on the ground on both sides, and they're not allowed to shoot civilians. They can't torture each other. They're not allowed to destroy the environment. They're not allowed to destroy the infrastructure. How do they have a war? I mean, war itself is a crime. Every element of it is wrong. So I was in the army. I was never in combat. The ground troops often, they're taking orders from the higher ups. And when you're in a military situation and the person that outranks you threatens you with, well, you're going to jail if you don't do what I want, that complicates things too. If all the troops got up and said, forget it, we're not doing this anymore, which would be great. I just, the whole concept of war itself to me is impossible. So,
Kathy,
any
Bill?
thoughts on that?
So I would say a couple of things. I think that many of us are against all wars and against, violence in general. But there are plenty of people who believe that violence, while not first, should be the last effort. And if it happens, it should happen in accordance with the rules that have been expected or have been articulated by various nations over the course of time. And that's where you get into whether a soldier has to follow an unjust order, whether a commander has to follow an order that would target civilians or would destroy hospitals, or because certainly the people who destroy the hospitals are going to say one of two things. They're going to say either we didn't know it was a hospital, which is hard to believe, or secondly, I don't know what they just told me go to this coordinate and unload the ship. And so you're not going to find very many people who are going to say, yes, I intentionally did this. But that reflects back on the entire chain. It reflects on the person in the helicopter, but it also reflects on their supervisor. But it also reflects on the people who build the helicopters and build these things and make the money sitting back in Bethesda, Maryland, or New Orleans, or Phoenix, or something like that, where they're going out to the pool at night because in their hands they think are clean, but they are part of the link of the chain that destroyed the lives of the people that were there and the facilities that were there for humanitarian purposes. So you're right, it is complicated, it is challenging, but it is something that we have to do because ultimately we are going to look also, we hope, at the idea of nuclear war, which is closer right now than it's been, in many, many, many decades. But the same justification applies to that as the hospital. Well, the hospital, we thought there were terrorists there, or we thought there were insurgents there, or whatever. But ultimately, who's paying the price and who is profiting from it? And there are plenty of people who are profiting from it. So our goal is to hold them up, shine the light, hold them accountable, hopefully help grow the international consensus about this into a place where people not only just feel shame about it, but they are prosecuted and held accountable for the work that they do, and we prevent it from happening anymore. And Kathy, you can supplement that if you'd like.
Well, just one thought that came to mind is that in some of the European docks, the workers have said, we're not loading those boxes onto that ship because we know where they're going and what they're going to be used for. And we have plenty of, here in the United States, shipments going to Saudi Arabia regularly of weapons that are produced here in the United States. So we hope the tribunal will make recommendations, the jurists on the tribunal, that will give all of us more to do. This isn't going to be over with on November 23rd. And again, if any of you would like to become more involved in the planning, we're at a point where we can anticipate thousands of hours of work to be done if this is going to be effective. And so please feel free to be in touch with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Teresa.
So Dan Shea, you're next. You have to unmute yourself. You're muted, Dan.
Dan, we
Dan,
can't hear you.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, I was trying to unmute it. Finally did it. Sorry. One of the things I wanted to say is, first of all, thank you both, Bill and Kathy, for the work you're doing here and to bring this to people. One thing that I wanted to just let you know that I've been working with students at Portland State University who have called for cutting all ties to Boeing locally here, and they're raising this issue. These are international students, and so they're raising these issues across the countries. The other is that just to answer one of the questions about soldiers involved being a Vietnam veteran, there's also the whole history of soldiers actually resisting war. And that is something that if people don't know or understand, should look at and understand. There is, when Kathy was talking about people, the unions in Europe not loading weapons to these countries. We have a great example of Brian Wilson sitting on the tracks and Concord Naval Base that was trying to ship weapons to the consulates during the Central American Wars and was run over and lost his legs in that. But many people continue to try and stop these shipments. So we have a long history of resistance. I think it's important that we continue in these efforts. One thing that I would like to raise is these companies is so ingrained in our communities that not just the manufacturing at one level, but the subcontractors throughout, one part being sent from one place to the next is controlling. Now, how do we look at how we retool the industry? Because these people that work there are looking at them as jobs and defend these people, and the unions often defend them because they're looking for jobs for people. We need to also propose that people are compensated and retrained and retooled in other industries, and that these people, they're not criminals, their corporations are criminals, and we need them to say they will no longer fund and work for these companies, but we need alternatives for them too. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Very well said. Thank you, Daniel.
I'm not sure there was a question there, but do you have any comment, Kathy or Bill?
Well, World Beyond War has a really interesting mapping project online that shows all of the bases that the United States has all around the world, and of course, surrounding China and surrounding Iran. And just imagine if all of those bases could be converted into doing actions that would actually help us deal with ecological collapse. And I think, the levels of corruption and gangsterism that often surround the construction of bases is another story to be told, full of criminality. So thank you, Dan.
Right, I see 8 people with their hands raised, and it's 10 after 9, and I think in another 10 minutes or so, maybe 15, we might not get to all 8. Let's see if we can. So if you can make your comment a little bit brief and pose a question, and then we'll move on to the next person. So Gregory Gillis, I see you next, please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Kathy and Bill. Fantastic presentation. I live in Canada, and the Canadian government has just announced, Prime Minister Trudeau, that Canada will be purchasing the first of 16 F-35 fighter jets. I wrote a letter a long letter yesterday to my local representative, CCing the Prime Minister as well. I teach high school in Mississauga, Ontario, and or in Toronto, and I find my students are incredibly receptive to the message of peace, disarmament, and they realize their future is at stake. But getting through to our politicians, I'm finding, is almost an impossible task. They give you a perfunctory letter back. We have commitments to NATO, we have commitments to our allies. It's the usual BS that is given to us. And I'm just wondering, I think this is a wonderful opportunity, the tribunal, to really garner some attention, some serious attention. And I'm just wondering if you have any other suggestions around, making an impact to get our movement into the mainstream. The peace movement seems to have lost some power. I'm trying to get young people involved. And I'm just wondering if you have some suggestions so that we can make this more mainstream. Like in the 80s, we had millions of people demonstrating in Europe, in the United States against nuclear weapons. So I want to be brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregory. Well, thank you for alerting young people to the kind of future that they're actually moving into. I've heard Bill say, we ought to follow the young people, and I think that's certainly true. Again, I'll mention World Beyond War. They've got some very fine Canada organizers, and I think street action is particularly important with regard to the weapons sales that Canada is engaging in. I maybe shouldn't mention this because I haven't really researched it fully, but apparently WikiLeaks has shown that the Irish anti-war movement came pretty darn close to persuading the United States military to get out of Shannon Airport. There had been 2 plowshares actions. There were very raucous vigils and demonstrations. People sometimes ran, right onto the field. And apparently, if they'd kept it up, they might have actually sent the U.S. military packing. So, and we should remember that the world came closer than ever before to stopping a war before it started in the run-up to the 2002 shock and awe bombing. So let us not lose heart, but we might need to up the ante of what we're willing to risk, nonviolently, I believe, in order to confront these war makers.
Okay. Thank you, Gregory. Mary Ellen, is it Kurkulos? Go
Yes,
ahead.
Kurkulos. Thanks, Ken. It's a pleasure to be at this webinar and to see Kathy. I don't exactly have a question. I have a comment, and perhaps Bill can address it, even Kathy, if she feels so. It strikes me that, it's so absurd, the hypocrisy, the way the law is implemented and interpreted. So a century or so ago, the rights of personhood were granted to corporations, and they were more recently affirmed in Citizens United with, money is speech and all this. And yet corporations, since they're people, they're never prosecuted. They're never for the harm that they cause, for the deaths and actually murders that they cause. And it's such a disconnect. And it seems very clear to me that it's a great example of how the law is really a tool of the powerful and used accordingly. But I think that this campaign can be really important, certainly to bring the stories of the people, the victims of these horrible crimes to a wider audience, but maybe even to break through and have people understand how warped the law is and how it is implemented. So any comments concerning that would be welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I would say a couple things. One, you're absolutely right. Law is the tool of those tools of maintaining the status quo and enriching the status quo for the people at the top. Absolutely incontrovertible. I mean, that's not to say there aren't people and judges and lawyers and legislators and people who are doing some progressive things. That's possible. But that's obviously the exception to the rule, where the rule is that the law is very conservative and it's trying to uphold power and not redistribute it or anything like that. So that's absolutely correct. Especially you can see it in terms of corporations. Second thing I would say, I think reflecting back on what a couple people said, the key I think here is to tell stories. Number one, this is what Kathy is such a genius. Isn't she? Is like telling the stories. It's one thing to say, well, you know, they bombed a hospital in Afghanistan. Well, that's true, and that's true as far as you go. But to tell the story of the people who were there, to take the time to learn that story, that is critically important, because we will remember that story. Well, we won't be able to remember just the fact about it. But just as important for us who are teachers and those who are activists and those who are challenging the status quo in that is the stories of the people who have resisted. As several of our commentators have put, you know, at every place there is injustice, there is also resistance. At every place there is oppression, there is also hope and courage and resistance. And so we have to tell the stories of the victims, but we should, especially for our young people and other people, because there's a concerted effort to make us just feel like this was powerless. We can't do anything about it. The courts are against us, the legislature's against us, the money's against us. That's all true. But people have made progress, and people have resisted and created beautiful things out of situations that looked irredeemable. So the stories of the victims have to always be there, but the stories of the individuals, and more importantly than the individuals, of the communities that resist and what they have done. I interviewed Dan Berrigan once and talked about how proud I was of him and all the work he had done. And he said, I don't believe in sheroes. I don't believe in heroes. I believe in community. And this is a community here tonight. Maybe it's a temporary community where people, but all of us are connected with other communities of resistance and communities of hope and communities that are not afraid to look at the terrible things that are happening, but are also not completely overwhelmed by those terrible things that are happening, because we know of the people in the communities, and we are part of the people and communities that are acting out of hope and love and joy and doing things to try to make the world a more human place.
That was a beautiful answer, Bill. Thank you for that. Thomas Charles.
Yes, to my mind, the most egregious of all war crimes is the fomenting of an unnecessary and an illegal war. And certainly with that in mind, the Iraq War comes to the forefront of my concerns and interests. Has there been any thought of the War Crimes Tribunal to bring charges against the George W. Bush administration for their part in that illegal and unnecessary war?
Well, I'd say a couple things, Thomas. You're absolutely right. And some European nations have tried to do that. They have gotten close. They haven't been able to break through. Code Pink did a big a tribunal on the Iraq War and helped document a lot of these things. And that is one of the issues that this tribunal hopes to be able to address. Again, I think a part of what we're doing is trying to make the record for the people who come behind us and the people who are in front of us. And you're absolutely right. There has to be some accountability for the lies, the mountains of lies that precipitated and maintained and continued to maintain the Iraq War and destroying so many of their people, our people, the environment, aggravating all these things on the ground. Kathy can speak to that much better, but yes, there are people who have tried and continue to try, and we will continue to try that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. We will be interviewing doctors who were at the hospital in Baghdad that many of us have visited over the years, and they'd weathered this horrible time of economic sanctions as well. And I mean, every story of people who were maimed or orphaned or displaced or bereaved from that war is just a terrible, terrible story. And it's kind of grim, because when you start to talk to people, they say, well, can you get any compensation for us? Can you get prostheses for my daughter who lost both her legs? And we feel that kind of justice, reparations, ought to be happening and could happen if the bloated military budget were redirected to do what should be done. I remember once being with a group of youngsters in Afghanistan, and Noam Chomsky, who's going to do an interview for us next week. In fact, he was on the phone with them, and young Gulumai said, Prof. Noam, what do you think about reparations? And Noam Chomsky said, oh, that's a very important question. Any civilized country would pay reparations. And you could just see the kids' faces light up. So that's certainly a goal of civilization we should look toward.
Thank you.
Okay, I see, what do I have? I see 5 hands here. And I think what we should do is have all 5 people go one after another, ask your question, and then we'll let Bill and Kathy answer all of them as much as they can. So go ahead, Louise.
Okay, now I was curious about what Kathy was talking about with the Irish and the necessity principle. I thought, that was great. And I also remember that Ireland was the first country to sign the treaty for the prevention of the abolition of nuclear weapons. Are anybody in the Irish peace movement interested in working with you on the tribunal?
Okay, thank you, Louise. If you keep that, there's the first part. Janet, is it Coburn? Go ahead. You're muted, Janet.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all for all your work. I don't know if you remember me, Kathy, from the U.S. boat to Gaza, but anyway, so there are different types of wars. There are wars of imperialism, defensive wars, wars of liberation. So for people who want to end all wars, I mean, I don't know if that's possible. But that said, I have 2 questions. One is there a UN body that enforces the laws of war? And the other is, could either of you describe the US weapons procurement process? Thank you.
That's a big one. Okay, so I can see Bill taking notes here. I'll answer this one part for you, Janet. The weapons procurement process, Wern did a webinar, might have been our first one. If you go to our website, Christian Sorensen explained that so thoroughly that if you just go look at our recording, all these webinars that we do are recorded and put on our website. You can watch him answer that one of the procurement of weapons. All right, we got 3 more people to go through here. Here's Nicole Salisbury, it looks like. Go ahead, Nicole.
Thank you so much. I'm with the Sierra Club Illinois chapter, and I was just wondering, so is the long-term end goal to put companies like Lockheed Martin and other companies like it out of business, to bankrupt them? All right, thanks.
Wouldn't that be great? Yes. Okay, Paul, you're next. Go ahead.
I think a lot of the people on the webinar tonight would love to plug into this campaign, given what I've heard. And so my question is, since our group's operating in different parts of the country and different communities, we've heard about things like delivering subpoenas to company officials. We've heard of things like visiting college campuses around the country. What ideas would Bill and Kathy have for how those of us on the webinar tonight, especially the 38 groups in our War Industry Resistors Network, can connect up with this project?
You know, I noticed Brad Wolf is on the call. I wonder if we could ask him to unmute himself and speak about upcoming events.
Okay, Robin and Joanne, we'll get to you. Hang on a second.
Hey, there. Am I unmuted?
You're good.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was a wonderful question, and thanks for your interest. We are, as Kathy mentioned, planning on returning to Washington, D.C. on February 14th, Valentine's Day, for this Melt Your Cold, Cold Heart campaign. And so if any of you are in the area and can join us that day, we are going to meet outside the Raytheon headquarters. That's 1100 Wilson Boulevard in Arlington. And we'll meet at 10:30 a.m. on February 14th. And we have a citation for contempt that we're going to deliver to them because they failed to comply with our subpoena that we delivered to them back in November 10th of 2022. So bring signs that say held in contempt and war criminals and merchants of death and things like that, so we can hold them accountable. And from that point, we're going to move to the Pentagon and try to deliver a subpoena to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, compelling him to testify. And that will be at 1 o'clock. And we're going to meet at, we'll take the Pentagon Metro stop, and we're to meet at the Pentagon visitor entrance. And that'll be at 1 o'clock on the 14th. So you can join us there. And also on the website, you can see a copy of the current subpoena, Deuces Take'em. We also have another subpoena that we just uploaded that people all around the country can use. That is a subpoena compelling witnesses to testify. So if you want to download that and print it and serve it on your local congressmen, senators, bank officials, people who you feel should testify in this, please do so, take pictures and send them to us, and we can then upload to the website. So thank you.
And Brad, if people who want to join in the research, following up on the point that Paul made, where do they contact? Tell them where to contact.
Sure. Go to merchantsofdeath.org, and our email address is right there. In addition to just helping out with research, there's also an anonymous tip box on that website. So you can email us via the website, merchantsofdeath.org, and we are happy. We have student workers. As Kathy said, we need a lot of help on this. So please go there and check us out.
Okay, good. Two more people with hands raised, and just, you know, if you can be brief, and then we'll have Kathy and Bill finish up for us. Go ahead, Robin.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And hello, Kathy and Bill. Up here in Burlington, Vermont, we're going to have a presence honoring the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, because it's the second anniversary, as everyone knows, on the 22nd. So on Sunday, we're going to be in front of the airport and also stressing the F-35, because those planes are, you know, terrorizing our neighborhoods. My question is that our banner is the used widespread, nuclear weapons are illegal. Now, I mean, when I'm just sort of worried about getting into arguments with people, because, you know, as you know, the United States is not a signer onto this treaty. So how do we argue that the 61 nations that have ratified it, and then the United Nations, this is the United Nations claiming that this is a international law now? You know, my question, I guess, is just how to phrase, how to deal with this in an argument with people. So that's sort of a long discussion. Maybe you could just send me a note in the email if you have ideas about that.
Okay, thank you, Robin. Okay, Joanne, you're our last question. Go ahead. You're muted, Joanne.
I bring you greetings from Washington State. This is a Boeing country out here. But I was wondering, and thank you both for outstanding presentations. Are there any recommended readings that you think, if we wanted to find out more about the public sorts of tribunals that you are organizing, is there any beginning readings that you're recommending?
All right, there's a lot for you, Kathy and Bill. There you go, Bill.
People's tribunals and international law. Where did you get it?
At the library. It's Cambridge University Press.
Thank you.
Got it through Amazon, I think. I don't remember where we got it. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to give a few comments and I'm going to let Kathy finish, if that's okay, Ken.
Yeah, oh, good.
I'm going to let her deal with the Irish peace movement. The question was, what UN body enforces the rules of law at war? And that is at this moment is the International Criminal Court. And a couple of people have already commented in the chat that, they, like a lot of other things, are not really super dedicated and super courageous, but they have done some good things, and they are actually the international body that is supposed to enforce this. And there is pending in front of them right now this remark, the 2019 complaint by French Citizens Amnesty International, a bunch of other NGOs, about exactly this from French arms merchants. And it's been pending for 2 years, so they haven't yet decided whether they're going to go forward with it or not. So it's a slow process, but there is a body that's supposed to do this. And it's one of our hopes among the many people who organize this, is that we might be in a position by the time we do all this to be able to follow it up with a formal complaint to the International Criminal Court. We don't know that for sure. Weapons procurement, you answered. The goal is to put them out of business. I think, if somebody is making something that's good, then, more power to them. If they're making something that kills people, yes, our goal is to put them out of business. I think of the people that are on this, certainly people who are doing things that are bombing hospitals and the like, and if you do any sort of a semi-deep dive into what the weapons can do today, these weapons are so sophisticated that they can destroy and maim and just ruin communities permanently. And that is the way they're designed. That's the way they're used. And we don't want those weapons, and we don't want people to make money off those weapons, and we want to get rid of those weapons. Are nuclear weapons illegal? I would say the best thing to do on that, Robin, is one of the most recent Plowshares actions that they have a website for that. And on that, there's a number of documents that they filed in court outlining in great detail the ways that the nuclear weapons are illegal, despite the fact that the United States and some other countries that have them say they are. And I mean, I imagine that the Nazi leadership of Germany would not have thought what they were doing was illegal either. In fact, in many cases, it wasn't illegal in that country. But in terms of the international standard of humans, which is now embodied in human rights law, country, or the wishes of an individual president or a Congress or something like that, doesn't trump the, I hate to use that word, sorry about that, but there is a developing body of human rights law and human rights expectations, and the kinds of things that Kathy was talking about and the kinds of things that are being documented, these don't pass anybody's expectations of how humans should treat other humans. With that, I thank you all for listening to us, and I'm going to let Kathy take it home.
Kathy, before you do, let me just show people that on the chat, I put Kings Bay Plowshares link there that Bill was talking about. Go there.
Thank you.
Sorry, Kathy, go ahead.
Eamon McCann from the Derry 9 was just in touch with us, and he is willing to testify as part of the tribunal. Right now on trial in Dublin today are Ed Horgan and Dan Dowling for their ongoing actions at Shannon. But I was the only defense witness that the judge in the Pit Stop Plowshares trial allowed to speak, which was, I thought, oh my God, they've got an albatross on their hands, because any jury, I mean, if any prosecutor could make me look like a nut job. But they were acquitted on all counts. And the barrister, who's since died, said at the time when he was summing it all up, he said, the question isn't, did these 6 have a lawful excuse to do what they did. The question is, what's our excuse not to do more? What will rise you? Which in the Irish context was a pretty brilliant summation. And so I feel I want to keep Mr. Nix's, Brendan Nix was his name, his question, what will rise you? And collectively, you know, we catch courage from one another, we know that. And we need all of that collective courage to go up against and do battle with the people who are delivering so much sorrow to our world. Geopolitically, we don't know what the future will look like. You know, maybe it's time for the sun to set on the American empire, and it's not going to go down easily. But to give it all we've got, I think is what it means for us to be human these days. So thank you so much, everyone who's come together. We've all learned a lot tonight. And I certainly will hang on to this chat. I have to make sure I save the chat. And thank you, Nick, for keeping careful notes of any questions that haven't been answered. We'll be sure we catch up with those soon. And Ken, thanks for facilitating, and Brian and Paul. It's wonderful to work with you.
Well,
Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Kathy. Thanks all for coming. WERN's next webinar is on February 8th. It's on the Ukraine war. It's Medea Benjamin and Nicholas J.S. Davies and Dan Kovalik. So I hope you'll join us then, and let's keep on working for peace, everybody.